There you go. You should be able to hear that recording is now in progress. Hi, everyone. Wonderful to see you. Wonderful to be together. We've got quite a bit to get through, and I'm actually really excited about this Pardes because this is my favorite style of music. Baroque music actually is my absolute favorite, and if I could have walked down the aisle to anything, it would have been one of the Brandenburg concertos. I'm a really big fan, so one of the amazing things about Jewish music, as we may already know, is how much it's been influenced by the kind of popular music surrounding it. And so I'll share my screen just for the benefit of those for whom it would be helpful. And let me know whether you can see this. Good, okay. So this is, again, a very broad brushstroke. We're covering a lot of ground and not a lot of time, because actually, to cover late Renaissance, early Baroque, as well as the influx of kind of organs and choirs and how all of those developed is actually quite a chunk of time, which is why I'm going to also devote part of next week's session to organ music and choir music in synagogue life, because there is just too much to say about that, and I didn't want to squeeze it into not too much time. So we will be continuing the organist and choir discussion next week, as well as we talk about Jewish music in modernity. But before we get there, I just want to define for us what Renaissance music and what Baroque music are. There's some overlap between the two, and there was a period of transition between the two as well, where many composers of Baroque-sounding and Renaissance-sounding Jewish music kind of operated. And so I've tried to kind of define some key terms, because the way that we speak about the sound of this music can sometimes be sharpened if we know what vocabulary to use. And so Renaissance music was in the period of 1400 to 1600, and some of its main characteristics is that it is based on modes. We've spoken about modes before, those of us who have studied Nusach, but this is a different kind of mode. So the modes that we speak about when we speak about kind of Western conventional music are different scales and different kind of functional harmonies and chord structures, different to Ahava Rabbah mode or Magen Avot mode that we've spoken about in the past. Renaissance music is characterized by polyphony as well, which we have spoken about before, 4 or more independent parts played at the same time, and that all of those melodic lines blend together rather than contrast. So there's a real feeling that even though there are many voices occurring at the same time, that they blend and they fit together. And one of the hallmarks of Renaissance music is the introduction of harmony. So not so much unison singing, not so much kind of this Gregorian chant sound, but bringing in harmony that emphasized the smooth flow of the music and its progression of chords. And so often when we talk about the style of piece, musical piece, that embodies Renaissance music, the madrigal is one of these that we point to. The madrigal is really emblematic of both kind of a Renaissance and Baroque style, and we'll talk about where Renaissance and Baroque kind of overlap in a minute. As I'm sharing my screen, Mark, would you, as you're already unmuted, would you like to read for us just this first box here about the madrigal?
Yes. The English madrigal, derived from an Italian model, is a significant element in the vocal music of the 16th century, the age of Queen Elizabeth I. Bennett's madrigals are among the most popular, include Weep, O Mine Eyes. The piece is apparently based on John Dowland's famous Flow My Tears, one of the most internationally famous of all songs of the Renaissance period. And no, I'm not going to sing Weep, O Mine Eyes, although I could.
That's okay, Mark, because it's actually our first listening example. I've decided to include a number of pieces that are secular at the time, so that we can have a better understanding of how the secular music at the time influenced synagogue music as well. And so I've chosen a really famous madrigal called Weep, O Mine Eyes, which I have sung before, and some of us may be familiar with it as well. And you'll hear, I'm just going to play a couple of seconds of it, and hopefully you'll be able to hear some of these characteristics that we've just gone over, some of the things that make Renaissance music what it is. But first, just a word about the composer. John Bennett was English. He was an English composer born in roughly 1575 and died somewhere around 1614. And we don't know much about his life other than he composed a series of madrigals that were published in around late 15s, early 16s. And he was an expert in the English madrigal style. So this is emblematic of some of this music here. So I could listen to that whole piece. I find it so beautiful. But that was just an illustration for a couple of seconds. You could hear the layering of the sounds, the voice parts as they came in. And once you got that kind of broader harmony coming into play towards the end of that example, you could hear how it was actually a conversation, a harmonic conversation between all of those musical parts. I saw some of us singing along with that as it played. That was kind of lovely to see. Any comments just on Renaissance music and its style before we move on to Baroque?
Can I get a word in?
Please.
Please. I just loved how the lines of music were woven together. And the singing was woven. Just beautiful. Thank you.
That's a really beautiful way to describe it, that they're woven. And actually, it's a really great way to envision as all of the parts kind of weave into one another. We can keep that imagery of weaving as well as we listen to some of our Baroque examples and beyond, because that'll be important as we continue. Thank you, Ellen. Any other thoughts before we move on? Okay, so next up we have Baroque music. I'm going to share my screen again just so we can have the source sheet in front of us here. And you'll see that Baroque music, while it encompasses many of the stylistic elements of Renaissance music, it adds some really important elements as well. So Baroque music is the period from 1580 roughly to 1750, but as I mentioned, there was this real transitional period, this overlap. So Renaissance music took us up to about 1600. Baroque music began around 1580 and stretched to 1750. And so we did have this period right there in the middle where there was this blurring of the lines between Renaissance and Baroque. But Baroque music added some ornamentation, which we didn't often hear in the Renaissance style, so long flowing melodic lines, but also things like trills and little melismatic turns as well, and more of a contrast between dynamics, so both loud and soft music, but also this interplay between solo and ensemble singing. Again, we have this polyphony that we had in Renaissance music, so 4 or more independent parts played at the same time, and something called terraced dynamics, which are sudden changes in volume that create the effect of an echo. And so we have this little excerpt from History of Music for Singers, the Baroque era. Brian Cohen, would you like to read this for us?
One of the key aspects of music at this time is that it was funded either by the church as it had been in the Renaissance, or by the aristocracy. Musicians were employed by courts or by theatres owned by rich noblemen, and they worked on commission. One of the most influential writers of church music was Johann Sebastian Bach. Bach wrote hundreds of choral hymns, which are now known as chorales, and some of them are still sung in churches today.
Thank you, Brian. So I bring this source because I think it's important to note that the provenance of many of these pieces and the sustenance of these composers was rooted in courts and churches, and so people would pay these composers to write pieces for very specific contexts. And Johann Sebastian Bach, we all know, if we're familiar with classical music on a kind of basic level, most people don't necessarily know that he had this real kind of religious music side to him, and that he wrote so many actually really important and seminal works for the church, because he actually was paid oftentimes by the church to write these pieces of music. There are so many works of Bach that I could have chosen to demonstrate this Baroque style, but I've chosen the Brandenburg Concertos because they are my favorite, because I'm biased, but also the one that I've chosen specifically I think really shows the difference between the Renaissance period and the Baroque. So if you kind of hold the kind of simplicity of Weep, O Mine Eyes that we'd heard, as we listen to this Brandenburg Concerto, I hope that it will be evident just how different these styles are. And so I'm going to play a couple seconds of it, and then we'll have an opportunity to have a chat.
Oh, I want more.
I know, so do I. But we have a lot to get through, and I'm sorry to cut it short.
Was there a Mr. Brandenburg who paid for all this, or is Brandenburg a place?
Brandenburg is a place, and I believe it's in Germany. Is it not a place? I thought there was like a Brandenburg Palace somewhere.
I don't know.
Brandenburg is where Prussia sprung from. Brandenburg, Prussia. I thought these were commissioned by the Margrave of Brandenburg, weren't they? That's why they get the name.
So there was a Mr. Brandenburg.
And a person.
Excellent.
Tamara.
Yes.
Interesting footnote to this is I had a music teacher who told me that he believed that the Brandenburg concertos were a job application, that they were never performed in their own time, which seems extraordinary to us. But they were sent as a job application to the Margrave of Brandenburg. They weren't commissioned by him.
Very interesting.
This is what I was told. Now, I may be completely wrong, but what my music teacher told me was they were commissioned, put away in a drawer, and only discovered many years later, probably never performed in their own time.
Wow. That's amazing. Thank you, Mark. It actually really ties into, I want to say it's a bit of a theme that sometimes, even though composers were writing pieces that were very of their time, they didn't necessarily get performed in that time and only kind of rose to prominence a bit later, which is what we'll see when we look at the music of Salomone Rossi in a little while as well. So any thoughts on just the kind of comparison between Baroque and Renaissance as we've heard it so far?
Well, Renaissance is more tightly woven.
Say more about that.
There's a spread out in Baroque music, whereas the Renaissance music is tightly woven together around a tune. Does this make any sense?
I kind of see the imagery, this sense of kind of a more like an expansiveness versus something that's a bit more contained. Nice, really nice, yeah. Anne, I see your hand, and then Rolf.
I don't know if you can hear me because I'm
I
using
can.
headphones.
Yes.
Good. It seems to me the Baroque is more complex. Not, I mean, in general art terms, it's not Rococo, but it is more complex than the Renaissance. Is that right?
It can be. I think I often fall into this kind of binary way of speaking, but there was some overlap in the two styles. So you do find some complexities in both. But I think what you may be picking up on as well is the additional kind of ornamentation that we'd found in Baroque music that wasn't always there in Renaissance. Rolf, go ahead. I'm going to unmute you first. There we go.
Would it be true to say that Renaissance music is more vocal? And although, of course, you do get vocal Baroque music, of course you do, in fact, you get more instrumental music in Baroque music than you do in Renaissance music. I mean, you played us a madrigal for Renaissance, which is vocal, and you played us a concerto for Baroque, which is instrumental.
So I think part of the reason that there was such a proliferation of instrumental music with the Baroque period is that you had this influx of kind of harmonic lines and dynamics and ornamentations and things that couldn't easily be executed by a choir, but could if you had an orchestra. And so actually I think the limitations of the voice, once you get to some of this more complex repertoire, I think it's very much there. But I don't know enough about kind of the breadth and depth of all of this music to say for certain. Any other thoughts before we get a little bit Jewish?
I was waiting to be Jewish.
So what I'll do now is I will, I know I keep going in between sharing sound and sharing screen, which is why it's a bit clunky. I apologize for that. So now we're gonna meet one of my favorite figures in Jewish music, Salomone Rossi, who was an Italian Jewish musician who was employed at the court of the Dukes of Gonzaga in Mantua. So he was operating in Italy. And like some of his contemporaries and predecessors, he was employed through a court and did a lot of kind of royal commissions. He published 6 books of madrigals, 1 book of duets, 1 book of canzonets, which are light madrigal style compositions, 4 books of instrumental works, including sonatas, sinfonias, and various dance pieces, a single balletto, which is a dance-like madrigal, and a collection of Hebrew vocal pieces. So he was quite prolific and pretty high in demand. And you can see if you look at his dates there, he was operating from 1570 until 1630. And so he's kind of right on the edge. He was kind of
60 years.
when Renaissance music was kind of on its way out. And in his heyday, kind of right when that transition between Renaissance and Baroque music was again kind of at its heyday. And this is really reflected in some of the pieces that he wrote, which employed some of these broader kind of pop music elements and brought them into the religious choral vocal settings that he wrote. Ellen, I see that you're unmuted. Would you like to read this this box here about
Me?
Rossi? Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay. In 1623, Rossi issued his now celebrated artistic choral settings of Hebrew literature under the title Hashirim Asher Lishlomo, which was published in Venice. In those compositions, he incorporated the principles and aesthetics of Western art music without regard to or reliance upon established synagogue melodies, modes, or other musical traditions or practices. They constituted a watershed event. We do not know for certain the extent to which, if any, these settings were actually performed in the context of a synagogue service during Rossi's lifetime, nor, if so, in what manner and precisely with what musical forces. They did not become part of any subsequent Italian synagogue practice or tradition, nor did they take root as a new synagogue musical format or aesthetic. It's likely that they were intended to amplify and supplement synagogue worship rather than to supplant or replace tradition altogether.
Thank you, Ellen.
So rather diplomatically entered.
So I think that last line is incredibly important, that his pieces were intended to amplify and supplement synagogue worship rather than to supplant or replace tradition altogether. And that actually is a line that I think we are still living with very much today, that as we kind of broaden and expand our view of what music and what liturgical expressions we use in the context of a synagogue service, that kind of maintaining that balance between tradition and innovation and making sure not to replace anything remains incredibly important. Are people familiar with Rossi and his works?
No.
No.
Yes.
Wolf, I see a hand.
Tamara, we actually, in years gone by, used to sing the Rossi Barachu on Kol Nidre night at Eileth. It was the only time we would sing it. And we also on occasion sang the Rossi Adon Olam, which I actually think was originally the Rossi Kaddish, but I may have been arranged by Naumburg or somebody. So it is in our repertoire if you look in our books.
The Rossi did two versions of Kaddish, one with 4 parts, I think, and one with 5 parts.
Thank you.
But
I'm saying that we sang it.
And they're not the same as Adon Olam.
Yeah.
Is there any chance of anyone humming this for us? Is there any chance of Rolf just hum a few bars just to remind
Of what?
of anything that you've just said, which is the either the, okay, and the Adon Olam?
Adon Olam Hashem Alach Terem Kol Nivra.
Yeah.
But not sung flat like that, sung properly.
Oh. Thank you.
It was beautiful.
Tamara, I think I'm right in saying that the scansion fits both the Kaddish and the Adon Olam, and I've heard it sung to both, the same music, because the scansion is the same.
Huh. That's really interesting. Thank you. And it's music to my ears to hear that Rossi's music's been performed at Eileth, because in the States, it is very, very rarely done in the context of most synagogue services because they are so technical and because they require a certain amount of kind of choral prowess. And we're going to listen to one of my favorite Rossi songs, Rossi pieces, that kind of weaves together some text from Psalm 80. It's called Elohim Hashivenu. And I love it for many reasons, but mostly because you can really hear some of these external influences from, I want to say, the pop music of the day, but that's what it was, the kind of Baroque Renaissance transitional style that was very much what people were listening to around that time. But before we listen, I just want to kind of answer the question of, we've all kind of heard that Salomone Rossi, as he's still being performed today, that he is kind of a household name to people that are familiar with the history of Jewish music. But actually, he had little to no impact on future Jewish composers whatsoever. And Marcia B. Edelman writes about this in our second text box here. Gail, could I trouble you to read this for us? Thank you.
What impact did Rossi's music have on future Jewish composers? In the short term, none at all. All trace of Rossi disappears in or about...
Can you share?
Oh, yes, sorry about that. Here we go. We are here.
All trace of Rossi disappears in or about 1628 when his last collection of songs was published. Despite the assertion in the introduction to Rossi's collection of works that his music was suitable for performance in the synagogue, the study hall, the house of a wedding couple, and private homes, there's no clear indication that any of his music was regularly used in this way even during Rossi's time. Whether overnight or somewhat more gradually, Rossi's music faded from practice. In fact, were it not for the chance 19th century discovery of a complete set of Rossi's books, all knowledge of Rossi's contribution to Jewish music might well have disappeared.
Thank you.
Can I just ask tomorrow,
Yes.
what tunes were they using in 1600s in synagogues, in shuls? Was it a chant like we know, or?
So there was some chanting. Kind of the thread of nusach remained throughout. We had a lot of kind of cantorial improvisation as well around that chanting. But we also had, I think, some of the melodies that sounded a bit Rossi-like, but weren't. And so when we get to Louis Lewandowski next, who is kind of in the 1800s, he was very influenced by some of the musical styles that came before him. And so the music that was kind of developing in the 1600s alongside nusach and chanting might not have been Rossi, but it will still have been kind of echoes of this kind of Baroque and Renaissance-like madrigal style singing. I want to say, if it wasn't Rossi, I'm trying to remember, I think the time frame on Zolzer was similar to Lewandowski, so I don't think it would have been Zolzer at all. But if there was kind of choral singing, it would have been this kind of Meshorerim style as well that we'd talked about last time, of kind of a small choir in the background. I've realized that I could have shared sound at the same time that I was sharing my screen, but I didn't. So I'm going to share sound now and share my screen so that we can follow along as we listen to Elohim Hashivenu. And this is one of these moments where I'm going to ask the question, in what way does the music correspond to the meaning of this text? If it does at all, so we can answer that question after we listen. That was just a bit of the typical sound embodied by Rossi and his music. And I put the text of Psalm 80 up because we often have conversations around how do we feel the music and the text fit. And it's a different conversation here because of all of the influences of the outside styles of Baroque and Renaissance music that kind of bore on Rossi as he was composing. So do we have any thoughts or reflections just based on that first listen? Mark, I see your hand. I'll unmute you, and then Brian. Sorry, Mark, you're still muted. I'm gonna...
Okay.
There we go.
There's a very obvious contrast between the two voice passage and the full choir passage, both in texture and I think also intentionally in volume.
Mm-hmm. Right, so I think what you've picked up on is that the dynamics here play a role as well in in that texture, and it's actually important. It's something we didn't hear necessarily previously. Brian.
I get the feeling of pleading.
Pleading.
Yeah, pleading in that mood of that singing.
Thank you. Naomi, I saw your hand as well.
I was just going to say, I think it's very important not just to say that Rossi is generally following the music of the time. He was first violin in the court orchestra at Mantua under Monteverdi. So his main influence is Monteverdi, and you can hear very important aspects of Monteverdi's style in the Schul music, although it's absolutely right for the Schul music. For example, one of the motets uses the echo, which is the thing used by Monteverdi, and the other thing that we hear in this one are the false relations. I mean, that's an extremely important part about Rossi's music. It was a real loss to us that he didn't catch on. What wonderful music we would have had. And unlike Lewandowski, where Schul music took off from Lewandowski, it didn't with Monteverdi. That was our loss.
Absolutely. Thank you. And it's a really interesting question. Where would we be music-wise if his music hadn't kind of faded in the way that it did? Had a resurgence eventually, but faded at the time.
We're indebted to Naumburg.
Yes, absolutely. If Naumburg hadn't found some of Rossi's old completed manuscripts, his music never would have come to prominence.
Is it worth just mentioning as well, Tamara, that he clearly had a musical background and family. I believe his sister was a famous opera singer called Madame Europa, whom I heard, and I don't know the truth, I heard she may have been, the missing Monteverdi opera Ariadne, only the lament is extant. I think she may have sung the premiere of that.
Wow. Thank you. Anything else before we move on, Gail?
It sounds very churchy, and given that the words
waiting for someone to say that.
Huh?
I was waiting for someone to say that. Go ahead.
And bear in mind that the savior being saved, it's Brian said there was a pleading to it, and it sounded like like we're going to tell you our sins and we're going to and save us because here are our sins, and it doesn't sound familiarly Jewish to me at all. At all. But what do I know? No.
Thank you for saying that. You've opened up the all-encompassing question, what sounds Jewish? Which I'm really eager to hear people's responses to. The absolute palpable tension during this moment in Jewish musical history is that Jewish music composers were influenced by the music, heavily influenced by the music that they were listening to on the outside of the walls of the synagogue, which in turn was written for and influenced by the church. And so synagogue music during this time period specifically sounded very heavily church-like and employed uses of Western functional harmonies that were found almost exclusively in church hymnal music at the time, in church organ music at the time, which we'll get to in a minute. And so there was a bit of tension as well between the Jews that wanted to kind of assimilate more broadly into this musical culture and that wanted to say, okay, we're okay with our music sounding a bit popular, a bit church-like, because we want to blend in. Versus the Jews that said, no, we have to maintain our individuality. There has to be something that sounds and that feels different about us and what we do and what we sing. And so this tension played out really interestingly as well once the organ and discussions around how and when to include the organ in synagogue worship came into play. So I'd love to move on and spend a little bit of time for now, but we'll spend more time on it next week on the organ, unless anyone has anything else to say about kind of Baroque, Renaissance, Rossi before we move on.
Only one brief thing to completely disagree with what was said. Rossi doesn't sound like the church music of the day, which is infinitely more complex than Rossi wrote. Rossi sounds, as you said earlier, like madrigal. It sounds more like the secular music of the day. Church music of the day is far, far more complex. The music of Monteverdi and Lasso and people like that is far more complex than Rossi wrote. Rossi is reflecting the secular style and not the church style, probably intentionally.
So I want to say that styles were in both, right? Like, so some of the complex and some of the simple, it did appear kind of in churches as well. So there was a bit of overlap. Gail, go ahead.
I'm actually thinking about the Spanish Jews in the 1500s, where we do know their music, and it was based on Arabic style music because of the fitting in notion. And so from 1100 or 1000 through to 1492, we had a lot of that kind of Arabic tinkly kind of music. And it's appropriate, I suppose, if you always want to fit in. So when did we start not fitting in? Did we?
That's a big question. Rolf, I see your hand.
I just wanted to say there's another piece that is within the repertoire. We sung the Rossi Baruch Haba, and where we sung the Rossi Baruch Haba, Psalm 118, Viv used to have a chamber choir, which used to go around performing in various places, including churches. And when she did her lecture on the history of Jewish music, the chamber choir used to sing that Baruch Haba. And as I recall, it was for 8 parts. So we had top basses and top tenors and etc. And it sounded very polyphonic, if only we could get it right. So I just wanted to go on further with what we know of Rossi's music and what's in our repertoire. Baruch Haba, beautiful.
Thank you. And Brian has alerted us helpfully in the chat that there's a website called myjewishlearning.com that does have a lot about Rossi's music as just an added resource there. Thank you, Brian. So now we move to a discussion around the organ in synagogue life, which is such a large discussion that it seems almost unfair for me to have only put 2 listening examples in. But you'll hear that they are quite different, one from the other. And as you can see, you know the first one of them. I've included Lewandowski's Ma Tovu because it was written for organ and choir and soloist. And so we'll get to hear it with organ, which I feel we probably haven't heard in a while. But just a little bit here about the kind of role of the organ in synagogue music and kind of how it developed a bit. Rolf, would you mind reading this for us?
Most synagogues in German-speaking lands introduced organs in the late 1800s, a development that would extend to other countries and continents as well, reaching its peak by the turn of the century. With full legitimization of the organ in the second half of the 19th century, its function also started developing and expanding. By then, the organist commonly played independently between cantorial solos and also in processionals and recessionals. Interludes served to introduce the congregation into the different moods of the service or to fill the silence during silent prayer. Thus, in the following decades, composers began to establish a specific style of organ music for use in the synagogue, mostly consisting of Jewish liturgical themes. At the beginning of the 20th century, this repertoire evolved into a fusion of Western classical music, liturgical, and folk melodies, eventually flowering into a form which could be performed at concerts as well as in the synagogue.
Thank you.
You go to West London Synagogue in Berkeley Street, that's what they still do.
Yes. And it's important to note, which I didn't include here, the organ is one of the instruments that was played in the temple. in the biblical temple. And so when we hear about all of these instruments, especially when you think about the instruments in Psalm 150, there's the kinim and the kinor and the minim and the toph and all of these. I'm trying to remember. I think it is the minim. I think the minim is the instrument in Talmud that was described as having a number of tubes and pipes. And so it might have been the closest thing to what evolved into the organ at some point. And so obviously the organ in Jewish music does not start in the 1800s. In fact, it was one of the earliest biblical instruments that we have. Mark.
Well, can I just be quite clear? You say most German synagogues in by the 1800s. Do you mean Reform and Orthodox synagogues? Or just Reform?
I think, so I didn't actually write this. It's an excerpt from an article on synagogue organ music. My assumption is that this will have been in Reform synagogues because there was a prohibition on playing instruments in kind of traditional Halachic Judaism. So I'm going to play two listening examples for us. The first, feel free to sing along with. We'll hear Ma Tovu by Louis Lewandowski, which we are very accustomed to hearing and singing in the context of an Eilith service. So let's hear a couple of seconds of that first, and then I'll introduce our second listening example in a minute. So quite the choir there, and quite a different sound, I think, than when we sing it. But I love hearing that introduction with the organ. There is just nothing like it. And as much as I grew accustomed to hearing that introduction on the piano, there is something really declamatory and majestic and full about hearing it with the organ. David.
Tamara, I can tell you, having grown up at the Liberal Jewish Synagogue in St. John's Wood in the 1950s and 60s, there wasn't a single service that didn't begin with that.
Thank you.
With full choir and full organ.
Thank you. So really the sound of the service then. Absolutely. So while we may be accustomed to the organ accompanying choir, I don't know how many of you have heard or are familiar with organ preludes. Maybe a show of hands if you've kind of heard the organ prelude before. Excellent. Okay, so a couple. In your experience of hearing organs as a kind of instrumental interlude in the context of a service, I'd love to just hear some reactions, responses, opinions. There are no right answers. What role did the organ play for you as an observer in these moments? Feel free to chime in.
I'm not sure that, I can answer that specific question, but I sort of, I think I didn't particularly enjoy it. It felt like very churchy to me.
Thank you.
it got you into a sort of quiet and contemplative mood, ready to start the service. And may I tell the story that Jan has just reminded me, when we were members of the Bushy Reformed Synagogue, which used to hold its services in a church. I don't mean in the church, although I mean in the church. And we once asked, and they had a built-in organ, and we once asked their organist if he would come and play for us during the service, and he decided that he wanted to introduce the service with an organ prelude by Bach. We thought that would be good, but when we found out it was going to be Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring, we decided it probably wasn't a good idea.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you. Brian, go ahead.
I remember, it's now distant memory, I remember an organ in services. I think we stopped it around about 1990, 91, 92 or so. And I didn't miss it. When it stopped, I never had a feeling that I was missing anything. But I do remember during silent prayer that somewhere I remember having a very quiet organ prelude during silent prayer. But so thereafter, I never felt the need that the organ actually added anything to my service.
Thank you, Brian.
Could I just make a brief comment, which is that my understanding is that the initial preference for an organ over other instruments, as far as the practicality of it was concerned, is simply that it blends better with voices than the piano. Now, I don't know what your expertise suggests about that, Tamara, but that was always my understanding. The preference is based on its better blending with voices than any other instrument.
You can make it softer.
So it's interesting. So from what I've studied, the instrument that blends the best with the human voice and that does the best job at imitating the human voice is actually the violin. And so if choirs were going to ideally be accompanied by anything, it would be a string quartet, actually, because the way that the strings mimic the both the vibrato of the human voice and the dynamics of the human voice. The organ, I would think, is a bit, even when an organ is played quietly, it does sometimes kind of blow vocals out of the water, only because there's an almost tinny quality to it. And there are some overtones as well sometimes that can, I don't want to say it can mess with anyone's ability to blend. Actually, the organ was a vehicle of congregational participation, certainly for my dad's generation, who grew up kind of high reform in the States and who were scared to sing without the organ. And so for him, I think it kind of bolstered his participation. Brian.
Isn't the cello and perhaps a clarinet closer to the human voice? And I've heard Kol Nidre with both the cello and with a clarinet.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's both the kind of tone of those instruments as well as the dynamic.
Range. Yeah,
the range, yeah.
We've just got rid of our organ, of course, with the death of John Ringer, and earlier that hadn't been played for many years, but we just got rid of it, haven't we? Because it needed repair and we couldn't afford to do it. I often think what a pity, but I know it had to be done. Just an observation, we always used to have organ accompaniment right until 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough,
pipe organ. It was a keyboard. It wasn't a huge, great pipe instrument like the one they've got at Berkeley Street. It was just an organ.
Yes.
There you go.
Just on the point of about the clarinet, I once read that Meyerbeer was once asked his opinion on the best music to accompany synagogue worship, and he suggested a wind sextet.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Wow. Gail, yeah.
I said that I think the first musical instrument, apart from drum, but was the flute, and but maybe that's because they only had the flute, which they made out of human bones and drilling little holes into an ivory and so on. Wow. So why wouldn't it be the flute?
My instinct is that the flute is actually in a really high register. So a flute could really beautifully accompany a soprano or an alto or maybe a tenor, but the poor basses, I think, would have a bit of a tougher time.
I think in Psalm 150, they mention the pipe, which you just thought is organ, but I think otherwise you think about the mouth pipes, also clarinetish.
Right.
Recorder,
Absolutely.
and that's the recorder has a frequent voice accompaniment.
That's true. Yeah. I want to just bring us to our last organ listening example and then just move on a little bit. We're going to get a taste of the history of the synagogue choir, which we're going to get into much more next week. But before we do, I want to introduce us a bit to Ernest Bloch, who some of us may already know. He is one of the most prolific, famous Swiss-born American composers, and a bit more modern. So his dates are 1880, and he died in 1959. And his musical style was fascinating because he didn't really fit into any kind of box or genre. He studied with kind of very contemporary, modern composers, as well as Mahler, Debussy. So he was really informed by a variety of influences. And he was really influenced as well by his Jewish upbringing. His father at one point wanted to be a rabbi, and his Judaism really impacted so many of his compositions. He released 6 organ preludes, an album of 6 organ preludes. I'm going to play one of them. One of the things that I just found kind of comical as I was reading was that some of these preludes were used to fill the silence during silent prayer. And growing up, having really embraced the silence as a moment to, be silent, having an instrument fill that silence as a kind of instrument of worship, I found really fascinating. So I'm going to play a little bit of this organ prelude for us now. This is prelude number 6 out of 6. So just a bit of organ prelude for you there. And interestingly, I think, some of these preludes, if you want to ever have a listen to all 6 of these organ preludes, if you've got the time, they have really interesting kind of different tones to all of them. You can envision different situations where they might be played as well. A little intro very quickly, with what remaining time we have, to the history of the synagogue choir. And this is by no means a comprehensive history in this quote, but I thought it was just a nice prelude, and we're going to get more into this next week. And I'm going to ask Naomi Perry if you're able to unmute and read for us, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The synagogue choir.
Yes.
Professional synagogue choirs were established as early as the 16th century, following the artistic model of the European churches. Choirs of 6 to 8 members would sing prayers like Aleinu, Ein Keloheinu, and Adon Olam. There were some who objected to this practice, but Solomon Chazan of Metz, in his manual for cantors, argued that just as it is impossible for the earth to exist without air, a cantor cannot exist without choristers. Among the few synagogue choral composers of this period, the most celebrated was Salomone Rossi, 1570 to 1630, court composer of the Dukes of Mantua. And then it goes on, Rossi published a collection of 33 Jewish motets displaying the beauty and elegance of the late Italian Renaissance. But it was not until the 19th century, with the emancipation and enlightenment of European Jewry, that choral singing became a regular feature of the synagogue.
Thank you. So next week we will get much more into the kind of nitty-gritty of the synagogue choir, the various forms it took and roles it played throughout the history of synagogue music and into modernity as well. I think it's important to note as well that synagogue choirs have developed and changed over time, but they have always been indispensable. And so next time we will hear a little bit more about the history of the choir and the various kind of choral musical settings that have been written. But I wanted to just end by listening to our choir. We have so many choir recordings that we've been able to make over the period of the pandemic. And for me, it's been especially a gift because obviously I haven't experienced a real live Aelith choral service during my time here, or hadn't until very recently. So we're going to end this Pardes as we end our services with our choir singing Adon Olam. I could also listen to that entire piece, but I want to respect our time and the fact that it's 2:00. If anyone has any burning questions or any comments or reflections, now is the time. Otherwise, I'm really looking forward to next Thursday, which is the last in our 3-part series, which was a very, very quick and not at all comprehensive history of some of our Jewish music history. And next week will be all about modernity, whatever that means, which will also encompass choir music and a bit more organ as well as some of the more contemporary Debbie Friedmans that we have.
Thank you so much, Tamara.
Thank you, Tamara.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Tamara.
Thank you.